Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I've got something really special for you, so come along with me for the ride. Today I would like to look at this remarkable novel by Susanna Clarke, Piranesi, the author of the previous Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is also a work of fantasy that I just love. I love Susanna Clarke. Oh boy. Piranesi is an incredible novel. It's almost a novella. And you know, I'm a poet, so I love compression. And, you know, this is a novel. It's only a tad over 200 pages long, so it really is somewhere between a novella and a novel. It is an incredible work of fiction. I was trying to think of that word that we now use for fiction, for fantasy fiction, speculative fiction. It is a amazing work of speculative fiction. You know, asking what if. In many ways, Susanna Clarke is really looking at whether it is possible for, you know, Christian theology, spirituality, you know, can we be re-enchanted with the world, you know, in this world of postmodern meaninglessness, you know, can we once again find meaning, find our place in the world, and be re-enchanted with what is around us, beauty, aesthetics, you know. This book is raising so many big questions around consciousness, free will. You know, how can a novel of 200 pages raise so many big questions? It's interesting, isn't it? A few years ago, I was very, very lucky. I was sent this copy of Piranesi to review for an Australian publication, which I did, as I said, a couple of years ago. And this is a copy of the novel that I was sent for the review purposes. And I had a ball reading the novel, exploring the world that Susanna Clarke evokes, and then, of course, writing that review for that publication. About 12 months ago, you know, my obsession with the Folio Society. About 12 months ago, the Folio Society of London announced that they were going to bring out their own edition of Piranesi. And I was so excited. You can see over here, I've already got the Folio Society wonderful 3-volume edition of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So when they announced that they were going to also bring out Piranesi, I was very excited. Fortunately, when they brought out their copy of Piranesi, it was not a deluxe limited edition. So it didn't come with that very hefty price tag that I often have to somehow save up for to make my folio purchases. I'm in a bind at the moment, actually, because next month, in the middle of August, they're bringing out a deluxe limited edition version of Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey. You know, the brand new metrical verse translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Emily Wilson. And oh boy, I've been saving my pennies for 2 or 3 months, trying to amass the, you know, little sack of cash I'm going to need to buy that Emily Wilson 2-volume limited deluxe edition. But fortunately, this one was not one of those. This is a normal. So this cost me, I think it was about 100 Australian dollars. It's just a beautiful thing. Look at this wonderful slipcase. You can see what Folio does. It's an absolute treat. You know, the slipcase to protect the book from dust and everything, and it opens up. It's a lovely, sturdy slipcase, this one too. Some of the Folio slipcases are a little bit disappointing, and they peel off a little bit after a couple of years. I'm a little bit disappointed with some of the slipcases from the Folio Society. Society. But this one, I think, looks fantastic, and I think it will do the job well. But look at this book. You can see the beautiful, luxurious blue and the use of gold highlights. And you can see these little birds here because Piranesi spends a lot of time communing with birds. He's a wonderful twitcher, you know, the bird enthusiast running around with binoculars and bird identification books. I am a twitcher. I love any references to birds. So I really enjoy that in Piranesi as well. And you've got the beautiful in gold embossed birds here, and it also goes on to the back cover. It's just a marvelous book, this. I just find the juxtaposition of that luxurious blue with the gold is just marvelous. Look at that. Oh, and you open this book up, you know, it doesn't have fancy end papers, fortunately, so I didn't have to pay for that. But just the luxuriousness of that blue, I think it's just beautiful. What a sea of colour. You know, and then you open it up, and here we have the wonderful illustrations by Julian de Narvaez. I think he's a South American or Spanish illustrator, and they've employed him to do the illustrations for Piranesi. Look at that. Every section begins with a beautiful, really fine black and white etching like that. So every section of the book, every chapter, if you like, begins with something like that. And then there are these incredible double page spread illustrations. So it's luxuriously illustrated. As with everything with folio, it's all hand stitched. So it opens just beautifully in the hand. For me, in terms of the re-enchantment with the world, for me, folio just adds so much beauty and joy to my life. This is where I spend all my discretionary income. It all goes on to books like this. I just find, you know, living with a book like this that opens in the hand so beautifully. They're all illustrated, hand-stitched. For me, it is my re-enchantment with the world. It just makes me feel good about things, like living with my Billy Blue. You know, Billy is just, you know, God comes to me every single day. You know, God comes to me with love, redemption, forgiveness, acceptance. You know, God comes to me in the shape of a greyhound. And I don't think that's sacrilegious. You know, God loves Billy, and God is totally infused in Billy. And I really do feel like I commune, have that prayerful relationship, that fellowship with God every time I am with my Billy Blue. I love it. And this is what this novel is about. You know, this novel is about becoming re-enchanted once again with the world. You know, finding meaning. You know, we do not have to live in this postmodern, meaningless universe where we are not at home at all. You know, we can live in a world that is infused with meaning. There's so much going on in this book. You know, Susanna Clarke herself, she is not a philosopher or theologian. She's a fiction writer. So she's only alluding to these big ideas in this book. And many of these ideas are alluded to quite contemporaneously. You know, they're not in depth or really explored, thrashed out. But I love what she does here. It's made me really think in myself about, you know, because I read a lot of contemporary philosophy around such matters as consciousness and free will. So I'm really interested in the big questions that Susanna Clarke raises in her fiction writing, but I also explore it from the point of view of, you know, Christian theology and a lot of contemporary philosophy. For me personally, you know, becoming re-enchanted once again with the world. For me personally, I am not a dualist. I am a Christian, but I do not believe at all in the supernatural. I do not believe in miracles at all. I'm sorry, but that's just my lived experience. You know, I have a history of bereavement. I've had 2 brothers literally pass away from accidents in my lap. I know about nature and about the fallibility, if you like, of the supernatural and the miraculous. I'm sorry, but that's just my lived experience. So I am a Christian who does not believe in the supernatural, does not believe in miracles. How can that be, you might ask? Well, for me, I am a monist in the way of Baruch Spinoza, that incredible Renaissance Jewish philosopher, who basically reanimated the world with pantheism. God is nature and nature is God. So he was a monist. He didn't want to have to defend spirit or soul together with the material and the physical. For Spinoza, there was just one substance in the world, and that substance was the material world of the universe, or multiverse as we now have, according to some contemporary physicists. So I am a monist. I believe there is only one substance. There is no supernatural. There is nothing miraculous. So how can I still call myself a Christian, you ask? Well, for me, scientists today, philosophers, they have no way of defining what is consciousness. We all know what it is to be conscious, to be the eye of our own inner motion picture. Likewise, matter. We all are built from matter after all, and we know how matter behaves. Physicists tell an incredibly rich and complicated story about how matter behaves, going back in time and forwards in time, with multiverse, all sorts of things. But physicists cannot actually define what matter is. And for me, I've reached a stage now where I'm beginning to wonder whether God is nature and nature is God, in the way that Spinoza reanimated the world with pantheism. But for me, I think God is consciousness and consciousness is God, and God is in all matter. So for me, God is not hidden. God is everywhere in their creation. I see God in trees, in birds, in the movement of the oceans. As I already said, in my Billy Blue. God comes to me every day in the shape of a greyhound, and I am reanimated with spirit. So all of these big questions that Susanna Clarke raises in this book, I love exploring them. I think for me, you need to read the Susanna Clarke Piranesi with certain contemporary philosophers or Christian theologians. Particularly for me, my favourite philosopher of consciousness is a young English bloke called Philip Goff, who's really developed this idea around panpsychism, that, as I just said, matter is conscious. At a very basic level, all matter is animated with consciousness. And is consciousness, in fact, irreducible? Irreducible. It is the actual reality of the universe. Consciousness is what keeps it all together. And for me, I think consciousness is God. God is in all matter as consciousness, and God is everywhere. So yes, I'm a monist. I'm not a supernaturalist. I don't believe in miracles, in the intervention, the divine intervention to stop. I think that's quite sacrilegious. God is nature, and God respects nature, their own nature. This is the way nature works. So for me, God is everywhere. God is all around me. God is not hidden. I'm new on this path, so I might think something different in 12 months' time when I've done more reading. But I am really looking at Philip Goff and panpsychism and the pantheism of Baruch Spinoza. And I really am coming to this idea, maybe, that matter is animated with consciousness. So it's not, it's hardly surprising, therefore, that our brains are conscious, because our brains are made of matter that is also conscious, very small. And obviously the way that is put together, within our brains allows a much more complicated, a much fuller version of consciousness to become manifest. I find this really interesting. Susanna Clarke in Piranesi also goes back to one of the inklings, in particular to Owen Barfield. And Owen Barfield, of course, read very deeply, not only into Christian theology, but of course into the philosophy of Rudolf Steiner. And he was really interested, again, in reanimating the world with meaning. And he was really interested in looking at the hermeneutics of text, the ways, layers of reading text, and how you need to put all these layered readings together. to really explore a text. And looking at Rudolf Steiner, he was interested in the way consciousness, if you like, has evolved in the universe, and how there have been different phases or stages of consciousness becoming manifest. Different stages that you can actually describe within human history, going right back to the prehistoric, to the very ancient Paleolithic, the ancient Stone Age. I find this sort of philosophy, this speculative philosophy, really interesting. Of course, it all could be wrong. It is very speculative. But it's what I'm looking at and excited about at the moment. So Susanna Clarke is interested in all of these types of ideas in this remarkable book. Is it a perfect book? Of course not. Nothing is perfect, is it? I am reanimated with meaning, reanimated with a sense of purpose through my relationship with Billy, through spending time with wonderful treasures like this from the Folio Society. They just add so much to my life, infuse my life with joy and wonder. And that's what Susanna Clarke is interested in. But I also find it interesting that Susanna Clarke, she's very interested, as I said, in the Inklings. She's a UK writer, and she is very interested in the Inklings, particularly C.S. Lewis and, as I said, Owen Barfield in particular, who was a very quirky, idiosyncratic member of the Inklings, a little bit like Charles Williams, who was very much interested in, merging occult practices and knowledge with Christian theology. Very, very interesting. But of course, no matter how nuanced, sophisticated, subtle Susanna Clarke is as a thinker, she might be very interested in the Inklings. And a lot of contemporary people, might want to see her as a fellow member of the Inklings. Someone like that UK Anglican priest poet Malcolm Guy. We're always looking for modern day versions of the Inklings. And a lot of people would like to see Susanna Clarke as part of that club. But of course, as a female, she would not have been welcomed by C.S. Lewis into the Inklings at all. The Inklings was a male exclusive club. And we just need to be honest and accept that. C.S. Lewis had no room in his intellectual life for women. We need to be honest about that. The only women he had strong relationships with were, of course, his mum, who died when he was a young son, a child. And then, of course, right at the end of his life, he married Joy. And that was a romantic, a beautiful relationship. The book that he wrote after Joy died of cancer, A Grief Observed, I find a very moving, powerful document about grief. I love it. I love C.S. Lewis's writings. I still am very drawn to the Inklings as a group of smoking, drinking Christians who found fellowship in the pub. For a young Baptist boy like me, they blew my mind as a young adult when I first discovered them. So I love the Inklings. But the Inklings would never have welcomed Susanna Clarke into their club. It was men only. We need to be honest about that. That's the way it was for C.S. Lewis. The other thing, of course, is that brings me back to this book. Is it a perfect book? I find it interesting that as a female writer, Susanna Clarke, when she writes, she so often writes the male as protagonist, the male as hero. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Of course, there are women in the world of that wonderful 3-volume fantasy series, but it is primarily a story about men and about the relationship between these two men. It is about men growing into their place as wizards, as sages, and their use of magic in the world. But it is a story about men. And Piranesi also, at the end of this book, some women do come into it, and there's a woman who comes in at the end who has a very important role to play in the world of this novel. But she only comes in the last couple of chapters. Up until then, every character we meet is male, or the alive characters anyway. This is once again, a story about men, even though it's written by a woman. And Susanna Clarke, as well as expressing, her love for the graphic novels of Alan Moore, and she particularly loves, the world of Jane Austen, Charles Dickens. There's a lot in this book about Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. I really pick up, my ear is really in tune to this. I don't think this novel could have been written the way it quite is without that deep love, that reading of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. But the other thing that Susanna Clarke, of course, says that really gave us some of the ideas for this was the great Ursula K. Le Guin, the Wizard of Earthsea series, and in particular, of course, book 2, The Tombs of Atuan. And the Tombs of Atuan, of course, a little bit like Piranesi. It's this wonderful novel that is set in this labyrinth-like maze underneath the ground, this incredibly dark, somber, difficult place. And, the maze, the labyrinth that Susanna Clarke evokes in Piranesi is very different, particularly to Piranesi himself, who loves the house and is the beloved of the house. And the house is also very beloved. But one of the initial starting points for Susanna Clarke coming up with these great ideas was the Tombs of Atuan. And Ursula K. Le Guin, I find interesting. Look at this wonderful illustrated version of Earthsea that I have. Here we are going into the tombs of the Eaten one, the young priestess. But Ursula K. Le Guin is interesting. When she came to write her Earthsea vision, she also, as a young female writer, she just accepted that, of course, the hero, the protagonist, had to be male. And when she first started to write The Wizard of Earthsea, this incredible multiverse, this incredible thing that she's created, she wrote the hero, the protagonist, as male. And it was all about Ged and, the discovery of Ged as a young boy and his growth into the greatest wizard or mage of his time, and the role in his using magic to fight down the darkness and dragons and all sorts of things. But as a very young writer, Ursula K. Le Guin recognised that it wasn't good enough. As a young female writer exploring feminism as literary theory, Ursula K. Le Guin came to the conclusion that she had to do better herself, and she had to start writing women's stories. She had to start writing the hero, the protagonist, as female. So when she wrote book 2 of this wonderful Wizard of Earthsea multiverse, of course, The Tombs of Atuan, who Susanna Clarke says was a really important influence in the beginnings of Piranesi, she wrote the hero as female. She saw it as her responsibility. So even though Ged, the young male mage, wizard, he comes into the world because, she couldn't change the fact that she'd already created Ged as male. But the actual focus, the actual hero of the Tombs of Atuan is the young priestess, the Eaten one. It's a fantastic book. Absolutely marvellous. And then, Ursula K. Le Guin, right through The Wizard of Earthsea then, she has this juxtaposition between gender and the way gender is represented. And she becomes more and more determined, as I said, to write the protagonist, the hero, as female, to write women's stories. And I find it very curious that Susanna Clarke didn't tweak onto this. She continues to write the hero, the protagonist, as male. Whether it's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell or Piranesi. And even though, of course, the female does appear in the world of these books, but they are very much men's books. They're stories, more stories about men. And I find that interesting. Talking about stories about men, I had to read, I have to read for you this little section. It comes towards the end of Piranesi, talking about men and the place of men in the world today. Who am I describing? This is right at the end of Piranesi. I think of Lawrence Arn Sales, and an image rises in my mind. It is the memory of a statue that stands in an upper vestibule, facing the head of a staircase, the one rising up out of the 32nd vestibule. This statue represents a heretical pope seated on a throne. He is fat and bloated. He lolls on his throne, a shapeless mass. The throne is magnificent, but the sheer bulk of the figure threatens to split it in two. He knows that he is repulsive, but you can see by his face that the idea pleases him. He revels in the thought that he is somehow shocking. In his face, there is mingled laughter and triumph. Look at me, he seems to say. Look at me. Who is that describing? Oh my goodness. I love that. I love the way we can, bring new meanings to bear on a text. New ways of interpreting it. So yes, this is an incredible story. It is a remarkable story about reanimation with the world. It's exploring ideas around free will, consciousness. How can we find meaning? It's asking questions about, is the universe purposeless, meaninglessness? Do we have to accept that we are not at home? And this novel, I think, really looks for a different patterning, a different way of being in the world. And one of the things I love about Piranesi, and why I had to race out and buy this folio, beautiful edition of it, and not just be happy with the edition I was sent, which is also, a beautiful hardback book that I was sent for review purposes. But when this came out, I had to go out and buy it. And I just love it. Rereading Piranesi to make this video in this beautiful edition. Oh, it's just magnificent. I feel better about being in the world. I live with severe depression and PTSD, but reading something like this, spending time with this incredible cultural artifact, just being with this book, in the company of this book, of this edition of this beautiful book, it's made me feel better about my place in the world. It has allowed me to reanimate myself with meaning, with comfort, with succor, with consolation. It's allowed me to again reach out for God as God reaches back for me through consciousness, through matter. God is visible everywhere, all around me. Every morning when Billy comes to me, jumps up on my bed and wakes me with love and acceptance. I go to bed every night hearing Billy sing into my ear, I still choose you. God comes to me every day in the shape of that precious greyhound. And this book is another reminder to be reanimated with joy and wonder. It is a wonderful book. It is not a perfect book, but what is? But it is a marvelous book. And this is a wonderful edition. Thank you, and bye for now.